Hi, my name is Dr. Sherry Gibson. I am a licensed psychologist. I specialize in aging, or what the field refers to as geropsychology. Welcome to another in a four-part series in collaboration between the National Consumer Voice and the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center. It's a pleasure and a privilege to come to you in providing these educational resources targeted for three different audiences: administrators in long-term care, direct care staff of long-term care residents, and families of residents living in long-term care communities. This webinar is focused on trauma-informed care approaches in a time of COVID-19. And this particular webinar is on empowering administrators. As we all know, the coronavirus has infected millions of people and has killed tens of thousands across our globe. A vaccine is perhaps a year away, and the long haul we face begs the question: how will people respond to and bounce back from adversity as this pandemic waxes and wanes? What will a post-pandemic world look like, and will our society prove to be a resilient one? While scientists are actively and continually trying to understand the multiple layers of physical illness associated with COVID-19, the stressors associated with the pandemic are also likely to have serious mental health consequences. It is quite normal to experience distress as a result of the chronic stress of this magnitude. The losses that are real, such as the death of a loved one without particularly the opportunity of a ritualized funeral. And the losses that we face now are also symbolic. When we are unable to attend to major milestones in our culture, such as graduations, Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, anniversaries, all of those types of traditions that are steeped in communion with others. And there's grief for so many, even unresolved grief for some. And there will be no one-size-fits-all response to this crisis. The individual responses, as you can well guess, are multifaceted, and I think are influenced by two main areas. The first is, what were the circumstances and resources available to people pre-pandemic? For example, prior exposure to adversity or even trauma, the physical and mental health vulnerabilities that people already faced prior to the pandemic, and either lack of or the availability of economic and social supports. The other important influence here is prior exposure that were encountered prior to, or since the pandemic rather. And those kinds of exposures include illness or the death of a family member or a loved one, the loss of jobs or health insurance as a result. Job status is an interesting contributing factor here, particularly those of essential healthcare workers, where they are continuously exposed to a potentially life-threatening illness day after day as they care for those who are ill. And the time immersed in social media or the news, an overexposure, if you will, to information that kind of wreaks havoc on our psyche as we take in the amount of death, the amount of cases, and the negative consequences of this pandemic. Also embedded in that is the community level stressors. For example, hotspots. So did the person, do you live in a hotspot? Did shops and restaurants close, never to reopen? Was there unambiguous guidance from your state's governor that was backed by the best science? All of this, including the emotional and behavioral responses to this ongoing crisis, will be multi-determined, but not random. meaning that the psychological science has isolated risk factors that can guide healthcare providers and social service organizations to identify the most psychologically vulnerable among us. So when we talk about trauma response, I'm referring here to not only the residents and families that you are charged with serving, but also your staff and your colleagues at the leadership level. SAMHSA, which stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Association or Administration, has a trauma-informed guidelines that they have well researched and well documented and provide lots of resources on their website. And through their research, they have really determined three main things. One, that behavioral health is essential to overall health, and that prevention works. Treatment for trauma is quite effective. So I want to talk about here the main elements for trauma-informed care. Important is that we have to understand the prevalence of trauma in our communities in order to recognize how that trauma impacts people at the individual level, and then putting that knowledge into our practice to actively resist the re-traumatization. And re-traumatization can be quite benign in what we do as care providers. What we think might be safe for an individual feels very unsafe. And when I think about this in the time of COVID, and particularly in long-term care communities, I'm reminded of the trauma that is experienced by so many residents when they are confined to their rooms, when they are confined from their families and isolated from the support that was so important to them prior to the pandemic. And it is that level of trauma that re-traumatizes people as they go through necessary precautions in order to stay safe and well. The underlying question when we think about trauma is not what is wrong with you, but rather what has happened to you. What are often called symptoms are actually adaptations to traumatic events. So the underlying question again is what happened to you, those symptoms being adaptations. And then the third piece of this is that healing must happen in relationships. Trauma results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and their mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Our goal here is to support any individual in how to learn or grow into living a very satisfying life. I've listed here potential traumatic events that are kind of categorized into these three categories: abuse, which most of us are well aware of, loss, and chronic stressors. And chronic stressors is one area that we often overlook, such as poverty and racism, an invasive medical procedure, or community trauma, historical trauma such as genocide, family members, maybe people who have lived with family members with substance abuse disorders or serious mental illness. And I will say that 6 months into the pandemic, we are approaching what would be a chronic stressor, knowing that this event in our history right now does not seem short term, but is probably more of a long haul. It's also important for us to understand the prevalence of trauma in our society. The exposure to trauma is ubiquitous. 7 out of 10 respondents worldwide and 9 out of 10 adults in the US report experiencing one or more lifetime traumas. Psychopathology in response to trauma represents a consequence of the very complex accumulation and interaction of life experiences that range from social to biological factors that occur over the lifespan, from gestation to death and across generations. Therefore, trauma can be cumulative. I'd like to switch now to speaking about the impact of trauma. It's important to understand how trauma impacts the brain. The brain, if you will consider, is a bottom-up organization, meaning that the brainstem and the midbrain is first developed and controls the most simplest of functions, such as respiration, heart rate, blood pressure regulation. The top areas, what we consider the limbic or the cortex, controls more of those complex functions such as thinking, regulating our emotions. And at birth, the human brain is underdeveloped. Not all of the brain's areas or domains are organized and fully functional. During childhood, the brain matures and the whole set of brain-related capabilities develop in sequence. For example, we crawl before we walk and we babble before we talk. The development of the brain during infancy and childhood follows that bottom-up structure. What happens with trauma, particularly when it's experienced in early childhood, before the brain is fully developed, is that it interrupts the normal trajectory of brain development. And so most of you are familiar with the nature and nurture understanding of human development, that we are biologically predisposed to develop in certain ways, but that our environment also plays a big role in that as well. So when there's an adverse childhood experience that happens during brain development, it interrupts those neural pathways that would be normal. From a disrupted neurodevelopment stage, then social and emotional and cognitive impairments follow that can lead to an adoption, if you will, of health risk behaviors that then lead to disease and disability and social problems, and in the most severe cases, early death. The effect of trauma on an individual can be conceptualized then as a normal response to a very abnormal situation. Most of you have probably heard of or are familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma. And typically this phenomenon or this concept has been used to describe our responses or our body's response that is activated by danger. Some common behaviors of trauma survivors, behaviors that are often labeled as problems, if you will, by the mental health system, can be linked to these responses and to the effects of trauma on the brain. This slide lists those three sets of problems that are often attributed to people in the mental health system and shows how the behavior may be a survival mechanism tied to that fight, flight, or freeze response. First is the fight response. In the mental health system, someone who struggles too hard to hold on to their personal power may be labeled as non-compliant or combative. Second is the flight response. And in the mental health system, anyone who emotionally withdraws or disengages too much may be labeled as treatment resistant or uncooperative. And third is the freeze response, or sometimes what I refer to as the bobblehead response. And in the mental health system, anyone who gives in too easily to authority may be labeled as passive or unmotivated. Many of the people we serve, and many of the people you serve, have survived circumstances that we can hardly imagine. What we often label as pathological may be the very things that help them survive. When we take a trauma-informed approach to the care we give to people, we recognize that those symptoms are or problem behaviors are adaptations to trauma, frequently including the feelings of helplessness and the loss of control that trauma often causes. Some additional signs that I have listed here include people having flashbacks or frequent nightmares, sensitivity to noise or being touched, always expecting kind of another shoe to drop or something bad to happen, not remembering periods of one's life, feeling emotionally numb or a lack of concentration and attention, irritability, excessive watchfulness, anxiety, anger, or feelings of shame and sadness. Each of these behaviors can in fact play a very important role in a person's life. They may have even protected that person in order to help them to survive. How do we take this information then and apply it to our practice of trauma-informed care, particularly during this very important time of a global pandemic? Again, understanding that the trauma brain often results in dysregulated behavior. So as residents' anxiety increases, their thinking brains become less engaged and their behavior becomes more dysregulated. Staff need to develop skills to help residents regulate and become calmer and more connected. This is achieved by lots of different ways, and I've listed them here. It's achieved by showing warmth, validating a person's situation, their feeling state, if you will, having flexibility with that person, providing structure to their day, to this moment, providing hope for the future, statements of hope. Humor, I can't say enough, plays such an important role. And being part of a connected community. So who is best to do that? Well, frankly, it's a calm and regulated staff. You have an important role as an administrator to support a frightened staff, remembering that healing happens in relationship. Staff, as like anybody, need to have strong connections with their managers and their supervisors in order to feel safe in turning to you when they need help. Leadership starts by assuming good intentions of your people and the staff's desire to provide good care to residents. I encourage you to seek out and listen to your staff's ideas about how to be creative in this time. Listen to their ideas about how to address residents' anxiety or fear, and understand the additional stress that your staff might be experiencing outside of your organization. We don't live in a bubble, and our lives are not just our work. Most of us go home and have to manage childcare now, have to figure out who's going to teach children during the day while we're working. There's also the addition stress of financial burdens when people lose their jobs or have been cut down to half time in order to keep somewhat of employment, but also not being able to be fully employed. And the additional caregiving that may be happening at home. I can't say enough about how staff live with the everyday fear that they may take home and may be carrying something of the disease to their loved ones, young children, or maybe aging parents that they're caring for, or an older spouse. Another important facet of this is transparency of information. So the information sharing has to be essential in order to prevent panic. Predicting and preparing your staff by providing regular information updates keeps fears to a minimum. And you can do that by regular check-ins, group texting apps. If you're not able to check in one-on-one or in groups, you can do this through technology. Or having open Zoom calls where staff can talk to administrators directly. I've learned throughout my work in long-term care and also in my reading of the creative ways that long-term care communities are flexing to the pandemic, is that administrators will have an open time on a Zoom call that people can log on, ask questions, clarify processes. And this is extremely important as, again, it sends a message of transparency and openness. And lastly, seeking out the latest knowledge, sharing it with staff, because knowledge is power. Maintaining connection is really important. It's important for all of us, whether we work in long-term care or we don't. But in your situation, creating mechanisms for staff to share their challenges, their successes, self-care strategies, and using humor is really critical during this time. I invite you to go out of your way to check in on people. Encourage humor, sharing jokes or videos, things that are more lighthearted, in order to provide some respite from the emotional strain the pandemic has on a lot of people. And for you to remain engaged and open and reassuring, also providing those statements of hope. Can't say enough here about the importance of taking care of you. Administrators have a heroic task in front of them. You need to have your own method of staying connected, checking in with each other. Staff look to you for guidance, ways to model how to be during this pandemic, and you play a big role in leading through example. When you model self-care and connection, your staff will likely follow suit. And always conveying the message that we're in it together and that we'll get through it together. Allowing opportunities for people to share positive stories with each other, elicit positive reflections on your day and your week together. Catching people doing good, highlighting the extra effort that staff are taking to ensure the good care of residents, and reinforcing healthy behaviors such as complimenting staff who are washing hands or helping a resident connect with meaning or family, taking extra care to sanitize high-touch spaces in your community. All of that needs to be recognized, and it goes a long way. As I close this webinar, I want to highlight again that healing happens in relationship. The way we get through it is in relationship. And in trauma-informed care, we have to understand the prevalence and impact of trauma. We promote safety and earn the trust of our staff and the residents, while embracing the diversity of experiences, providing holistic care, respecting human rights, allowing space for the person to pursue their strengths, their choice, and their autonomy, and sharing power, because you as an administrator hold the highest power in your community. And so the way that we balance power, I've mentioned this in the previous webinar, is that we allow others to share. We stop talking and we allow another person to start talking so that we can learn from them. When we allow that space to happen, we share the power. Communicating with compassion. And again, that's just validating another's experiences, normalizing the difficulty right now, and even having statements that we're all living through a pandemic that we've never lived through before. We're all feeling in the dark to some degree, and providing statements of hope that we will get through it together and that there is an end in sight. I want to thank you for attending this webinar, There are some resources available to you. I've also included some further reading if you'd like. I really recommend the last one listed here by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is The Body Keeps the Score. Very important read, probably the best read out there on trauma-informed care. I've also included a bibliography that helped guide this webinar. And you will also be able to find additional resources through the through NORC and through the National Consumer Voice that I've listed here as well. There are some links for you and also where you can find those links or find more information at both the Consumer Voice and the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center. Thank you again for your time, and I wish you well.